we continue our process of attempting to untangle the forces that lead us to continue to intervene militarily around the world when there appears to be no rational reason for doing so. Returning to the program now is Professor Andrew Bacevich. Professor Bacevich is an expert in this area. He is Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy, as well as a historian. He has taught at West Point and Johns Hopkins, as well as Boston University, author of a number of books on the subject, including Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War. And he's the author of a more recent piece, a short piece entitled, What Happens When Just a Few Volunteer and the Rest Just Watch. So he joins us now. Professor Bacevich, first of all, thanks for coming back on the program.
Glad to be with you.
Secondly, your piece, which I found in Tom Dispatch, but has been published elsewhere as well, is filled with a lot of, I think, important thoughts, and probably we won't even have the time to go into all of them. But I guess I want to start with this. One of the takeaways I had from your piece is this notion that having military power confers an obligation to intervene, that somehow we've developed the notion that because we have the most powerful military machine in the world, it becomes our obligation to act, even when not acting might be a more rational reaction. Is that, first of all, is that a fair conclusion to draw from your article?
Well, I think so. I mean, I would probably expand on the point a little bit, making a couple of points. One is that ever since World War II, and especially since the end of the Cold War, our foreign policy elites, and by that I mean people who are elected to office, appointed to office, or float around Washington commenting on our role in the world, elites have, with something close to unanimity, subscribed to this notion that American global leadership is absolutely essential. And anything that suggests the backing away from this role is dangerous. They would say dangerous to ourselves, dangerous to others as well. Secondly, however, particularly since the end of the Cold War, those elites have come to the conclusion that the exercise of military power provides the clearest and indeed most effective way of demonstrating that we are indeed the indispensable nation, the country that really leads the planet. And despite the disappointments that have occurred in recent years, occurred as a direct result of trying to implement those two notions, there's very little evidence in Washington that people are willing to rethink them, reevaluate them, tote up the costs. And so we keep on trying.
And it seems to me that there are a number of factors, cultural, social, and so on, that drive into it. But one of the things that seems to me to be a prime driver in all of this is it seems as if we've stopped thinking about military capability as a tool, and that as a culture, and I would say as a culture from the liberal side of the spectrum to the conservative side of the spectrum, that we've started to fetishize all things military, which seems to me, whether you are a diplomat or a writer or a military person yourself, that it seems to me that that's not a wise thing to do. You write in your piece about how we have all these commands now, Latin America command and Europe command and this command and that command, and you wonder, sarcastically, will we have a galactic command? It seems to me, I recall when the invasion of Iraq took place, suddenly I turned on my TV one day and every journalist knew the term CENTCOM. from. And they didn't even explain it. It was like, by knowing it, you somehow, as a non-military person, belong to a special club. And I just wonder if we aren't giving some sort of ritual meaning to military intervention that burdens and damages the decision-making process. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I probably, in terms of fetishizing, I probably would say that it is the American soldier who is the subject of being sort of elevated to some status in American society, and that the perceived imperative of supporting the troops, of expressing our high regard and respect for soldiers, that impedes critically assessing what we've sent our soldiers to do. So, especially, I think, in mainstream politics, it's not that you could find many people writing articles or op-eds or giving interviews that make the case that our emphasis on military power, our penchant for interventionism, have been wrong-headed. But I think the closer you get to the seat of power, the less likely you are to hear those arguments. And if you're making those critical arguments, the less likely you are to be held. So within the Beltway, if I could just put it that way, the consensus that you described earlier, and to emphasize, it is a consensus to which Democrats and Republicans alike subscribe, is very, very strong. And the number of people who are willing to question it are very few indeed.
And I think that when we accept that as a given, I am still trying to decode, for example, and let me find it here, something that Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is a senior State Department official under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in the Obama administration, she tweeted this out in shortly after the latest bombing of Syria. And I've been trying to decode it ever since in one sense. I believe that the US, UK, and France did the right thing by striking Syria over chemical weapons. It will not stop the war nor save the Syrian people from many other horrors. It is illegal under international law, but it at least draws a line somewhere and says enough. Now, to me, this seems so typical of that consensus that you described, that elite consensus, that Washington consensus. It seems to include the notion that military action is a form of communication, that it draws a line, that it gives or might give a leader a bloody nose, or it says enough. It's military action is speech, and I don't know. I'm interested in your thoughts on the subject, but that seems to me illogical at best.
Yeah, I'm hard pressed to see how you could publicly make a statement that an action by the U.S. government is illegal, but I support it anyway. I mean, I just, where does that leave us? And I think even her conclusion is wrong. It doesn't draw a line. I mean, if a rather insignificant missile attack draws a line, well, Trump did that a year ago. Too much applause, probably too much applause from people like Anne-Marie Slaughter. And a year later, actually in the interim, Assad continued to use chemical weapons. So now he's been poked in the nose again. And the expectation that somehow he's going to refrain from doing what he thinks he needs to do in order to maintain himself in power, I think it's silly. But her comment, I think, is indeed evidence of the herd-like behavior of members of the foreign policy establishment to applaud military action rather than to assess it with a certain amount of critical detachment and skepticism, and indeed to treat this action by Trump as if it were occurring in isolation rather than an example of yet one more military attack on top of the attacks in any number of countries over the previous decade and a half. I mean, one might ask Anne-Marie Slaughter, what will it take before you're willing to ask any first-order questions about our approach to policy? And I think I guess it would take a lot.
Well, I guess so. And again, we're talking with Professor Andrew Bacevich about our nation's attitude toward military intervention. And we also get presented in the media and elsewhere, and I do want to talk about the media's role in this, with a kind of binary that says, if you don't support this act of intervention, then you don't care about the people suffering in Syria. You must be sympathetic to Assad. And what strikes me about it too, in terms of this pro-intervention bias, is here we have Syria, where we're being told, we're being reminded of the suffering of people there, which is tragic. Everybody acknowledges that, and told that our only option is to act militarily, breaking the law and doing so without waiting until inspectors on the ground get there. And incidentally, the day after we call in an airstrike, and yet nearby in Yemen, we are engaged in military activity in support of Saudi Arabia. That military activity, that proactive military intervention that we are doing for the Saudis, is causing, in my opinion anyway, enormous human misery. And yet there we're not called upon by the media to feel the same level of compassion or to feel the same call to stop doing something military as we are always called upon to do something military.
Right. Our compassion is certainly very selective, and nor will this trivial attack by the United States, France, and Great Britain do anything to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people that we supposedly care about. I mean, if indeed we cared about the plight of the Syrian people, there are things that we could actually do that would have an immediate, effective, and substantial result in addressing their plight. I mean, we could, for example, increase the immigration quota of Syrians and get them out of the war zone, get them to our country where there's a lot less likelihood that they're going to get bombed and shot and killed. But of course, our compassion does not extend to the point of actually wanting to do anything that might cause us as citizens to have to participate in any sacrifice. So throwing a few missiles makes us all, I guess, feel better about ourselves, even though it doesn't do anything to address the problem.
And I guess the last thing that I would ask you about is, in terms of trying to decode this bias that we have and the selective bias and where our compassion goes, one of the documents I went back and looked at recently was Bill Clinton's speech to the nation seeking support to put peacekeeping troops in Bosnia in the late 90s. And in that speech, he talks about our exceptional and unique burden as a nation. He invokes World War II, and I think there's a kind of national yearning for the sense of purpose people felt in World War II for the, if you will, a good war. And is there any way to kind of break that hold of that what I would describe as kind of myths? I'm not judging World War II when I say that, but this mythologized view of ourselves that we have, of the kind of Lone Ranger going in and fighting the good fight, or players in a World War II movie or whatever. Is there any way? Do you see any way to break that chain in our culture and start thinking about military action and ourselves?
No, I don't. Let me interrupt.
Okay.
I mean, this is hardwired into us. It goes back to the founding of Anglo-America, a city upon a hill, charged to somehow remake the world in our own image. None of it makes any sense. None of it derives from a realistic reading of actual no-kidding history. It is shot full with myth. But the very fact that presidents like Clinton, and certainly he's not the only one, that they can tap that myth in order to justify actions that they have in mind is testimony to how powerful it is.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, although I try, Professor Bacevich, to lean towards optimism. But we will, I will accept your assessment, at least for now. Maybe, who knows, maybe the generations coming up will be smarter about all of this than our generations have been. But in any case, as always, I really appreciate your contributions to this dialogue, and I thank you once again, Professor Andrew Bacevich, for coming on the program.
Thanks very much.